So hi everyone, I'm really happy to start again the Shannon channel this season for this year. So this year we're going to start the first talk this year with Joao Ribeiro, and he's going to talk about coded and uncoded trace reconstruction.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Salim. Let me just share my screen. Okay, great. So can you guys see it? I guess you can.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, yeah, thanks. I want to thank Salim for the invitation. Also, Serge for helping me set things up. Let me just do something here because I don't want to see my video. Okay, so today, I mean, my goal here is really I'm going to talk about trace reconstruction, which is a problem that has received quite a lot of interest in the past few years, both in the theoretical computer science and in the information theory communities. My goal is really to give just a general overview of the main results that in the end leads to a very recent setting that we've been studying, which is coded trace reconstruction. And there we're going to touch upon some joint work of mine with Magdi Cherakchi, who's my PhD advisor, Ryan Gabriels, and Olgica Milankovic. So yeah, let's get started. And I'm not going to assume a lot of background. Also, I mean, if you have any questions or if I'm not clear somewhere, just let me know. Okay, so the starting point really is the deletion channel, which, if you're not familiar with, is just a channel that takes as input an n-bit string and essentially deletes some bits. So what you see as the output is just a subsequence of your input string. And these errors are notoriously difficult to handle because they're not memoryless. In the sense that you lose synchronization because you're not sure of the true indices of the bits that you see. Because, for example, there are a lot of deletion patterns that could lead to the same output like this. We're going to care mostly about IID deletions, which means that when you send a bit to the deletion channel, it's independently deleted with some fixed probability. And like I said, I mean, deletions are hard to handle, and there are a lot of open problems regarding the deletion channel, even basic ones like finding its capacity. We're not going to be dealing directly with the deletion channel. We're going to be talking about trace reconstruction over the deletion channel, which was introduced in the early 2000s. And here the setting is that you have an unknown bit string X with n bits, and you send it through several deletion channels, and you produce several outputs. So you have T outputs, which you call traces, Y1 through YT. And your goal is to devise a reconstruction algorithm that given the traces, first recovers X with high probability. Here, high probability, we take it to mean roughly 1 minus 1 over n, where n is the length of X. And also, we want to minimize the number of traces that we use. So this was introduced first by Levenstein in the combinatorial setting, and then by Batu et al. Later in this IID setting, which is the one we're most interested in. So this isn't a nice theoretical problem. There was actually an original motivation for this, was basically multiple sequence alignment in computational biology. So biologists are interested in, so you have DNA from some species, and you want to find the common ancestor of these species. And the way the evolution process works is that you have some ancestor DNA, which as time passes, gets mutated by insertions or deletions or even substitutions into the DNA of several descendants. And at the present time, you really just see the descendants, which are your traces, and you want to recover something that's close to your ancestor DNA so you can find the common ancestor. Of course, trace reconstruction is a simplified version of this problem because, the errors here are clearly not IID, but this gives some motivation, and we'll actually see that recently some other motivation arose, and we're going to discuss that when we get to coded trace reconstruction. Okay, so people have been studying two main settings for this setting of uncoded trace reconstruction, because I say uncoded because in this motivation with the DNA and sequence alignment, you cannot really code the DNA of your ancestor. So it's just an arbitrary string, and your reconstruction algorithm needs to work for arbitrary strings. So this leads to two settings. The first one is worst case reconstruction, where you need that your reconstruction algorithm works with high probability for every input string. And you also have a relaxation of this, which is average case reconstruction, where you no longer require that your algorithm works for every string, but just that its average error probability when average over all input strings is small. Another way of looking at average case reconstruction is that your input string can be uniformly random. Do you have any questions? Is it clear?
Everything is clear so far on my side.
Okay, great. So let's get into more technical detail. So my goal here really is to give an overview of both these settings in the first part. And we're going to start with worst case reconstruction. So here are some of the main results. So this was first studied by Batu et al. In the original paper, but they focus on a setting where the deletion probability is really small. And we're mostly interested in the case where the deletion probability is a constant. In that case, there are two works that are basically the most relevant to my presentation here today. The first one by Ollenstein et al. And the second one was a concurrent independent result by Day, O'Donnell, and Cervedio, also by Nazarov and Paris. They published in the same conference. And the cool thing about these two last results is that they use a very simple type of algorithm called the mean-based algorithm. And I'm going to present it because they draw on very interesting techniques from complex analysis, especially in particular the last work from 2017. So, okay, so I mean, the first thing is really what is a mean-based algorithm for trace reconstruction? So imagine that you have the usual setting for the deletion channel. You have some input x, where just for clarity, we're going to be looking at x over -1 and 1 instead of 0 and 1. You send it to a deletion channel, and what you get at the output is just a subsequence of x that we're going to pad with zeros so that it has the same length as x. Okay, and given this kind of modified deletion channel, we can look at the mean trace. And the mean trace really is just the vector of expected values of all the bits of the output. This is a nice function. It's a linear function of x. It's not easy to compute or anything, but a mean-based algorithm, what it does is you take a whole bunch of traces, you compute an estimate of your mean trace. This can be easily done. And you basically output your estimate of the reconstruction will be the string that has the closest mean trace to your estimate. And the result that was proved was really that you need exactly or roughly exponential cubic root n traces. I'm ignoring constants here for any mean-based algorithm. So this is a tight result for mean-based algorithms for worst-case reconstruction, and it is also the best upper bound for worst case reconstruction that we have right now. So the algorithm is simple. The problem really is the analysis. And what's going to happen is that we're going to draw on very powerful techniques from complex analysis to analyze this, which is a bit surprising because there's nothing, I don't know, so complex analytic about it. So how does this connection work really? So,
Joao, I have a question.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you maybe clarify, because you talk about mean-based and worst case, so
yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess it's so mean-based is just the name of the algorithm in the sense that it estimates the mean trace of your
and the worst case. What does it mean? The worst case.
Worst case means that you want this to work for any input. And
what does work mean?
Work mean I need any x that you give me. I want to. So you give me some x, you get the traces. And you want that the reconstruction algorithms should succeed in recovering x for any x.
Okay, and succeed meaning probability of
output the correct x.
Oh, absolutely. You don't allow any probability of.
Yeah. So the error probability should be small for any input string that you give me. Yeah.
Isn't that the best case trace reconstruction instead of worst case?
Yeah, it's worst case in the sense that your algorithm works for the worst string possible, while in average case it only works on average.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where the naming. It's a kind of a theoretical computer science naming kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
No, I guess we're good.
Okay, let's continue. So yeah, I'm going to just briefly mention like the connection between these mean-based algorithms, how do you analyze them, and complex analysis. And so first of all, an observation that's quite standard in these statistical reconstruction problems is that basically the number of traces or number of samples that you are required to use for an accurate estimate of your mean trace is essentially dictated by the distance between any two mean traces from two different strings. But since the mean trace is just a linear function, this ends up being just the minimum of the one norm of your mean trace over all x's with elements in -1, 0, and 1. So this is the quantity that you want to understand. Like we want to understand what's this minimum. We want to bound it. And in order to do this, O'Donnell and Cervedio, also Nazarov and Paris, they look at what's called the deletion channel polynomial. So they take the mean trace and they put it as the coefficient of a polynomial over complex numbers. And the reason why this is successful is that we will show that basically bounding this minimum one norm, or which is in essence bounding the statistical distance between two mean traces, or the total variation distance, if you want to call it, is in essence equivalent to maximizing a special type of polynomial over an arc of the complex circle. And so you can draw on very powerful complex analytic tools to do this. Okay, so one thing that you may be wondering is that, I mean, sure, you can define this deletion channel polynomial. The problem is really that, I mean, these coefficients are hard to compute, so this is not really useful at first sight. But one thing that happens is that turns out that it's very easy to rewrite this deletion channel polynomial such that now the coefficients are explicit in terms of x, and they have a very simple form. So in essence, if you, instead of having w, you make a change of variable to this z that's given like it's set like here, you get a deletion channel, you get a polynomial with coefficients corresponding to the symbols of x. Why is this useful? Well, because of the following observation, that this is really just what's called a Littlewood polynomial that we're going to call a of z, because the coefficients of x are either -1, 0, or 1. And this is a well-studied class of polynomials. In particular, there is this result from Borwin and Erdely that essentially bounds the maximum of these polynomials over an arc. So if you have your unit circle and you have an arc between -π/L and π/L in angle, if you give me any Littlewood polynomial, then the maximum over this arc will be at least e to the minus some constant times L, where L basically dictates the length of this arc. Question now is really, I mean, what does this, how can you use this to bound the one norm of your mean trace? And the connection is simple, and it's so simple that I can show you here in what's left of this slide. So what you do is first you pick W so that the Z lies in this arc. Okay, pick any W that satisfies this. And we're just going to use, first of all, we're going to use a very trivial application of the triangle inequality. And this gets us to this inequality where on the left-hand side, we have something that's kind of like the one norm of the mean trace, except that it has these W to the J terms. On the right-hand side, we have the Littlewood polynomial. But we can get rid of the W to the J because with some very simple trigonometry, we can show that if W is such that Z lies on that arc, then the modulus of W is never very large. So we can always divide by the maximum over this modulus to get a lower bound for the one norm of the mean trace for any x. And since this works basically for any W, and so it works for any theta in the arc, which is an angle, we can add the maximum, and we can now use the result from Borwein and Erdely on the left-hand side, and we can just maximize this with respect to L that controls the length of the arc to get the one norm of a mean trace is always lower bounded by exponential to the minus some constant cubic root n. Like I said, this is a lower bound on the statistical distance between any two mean traces, and this immediately gives us that exponential of cubic root n traces suffice to distinguish between two mean traces and correctly recover x. Okay, is there anything that wasn't clear here? Any question that you might have?
I think everything is okay. And what would be the complexity of the?
Oh, complexity. So you can write a linear program to do this. That's going to take same number of time as number of traces. So it's exponential cubic root n as well, in time.
Is that good or bad? So...
That's exponential, but that's the best you can do because you already have exponentially many traces. So you cannot hope for an efficient algorithm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so this was okay. Like I said, this result is tight. I'm not going to go over the proof that this is tight because it requires a bit more technicalities. But essentially, this comes from the fact that this result from Borwein and Erdely is tight as well. So you kind of transfer the tightness from Borwein and Erdely to this setting with some trigonometry. Okay, so this basically wraps up what I wanted to say about worst case reconstruction. Of course, if you want to improve on this bound, you really cannot use just these mean-based algorithms. You really need to think about other types of algorithms for breaking this bound. So we really need some new ideas here. Okay, so moving on, we're going to go into average case reconstruction, where we recall that now we just want that the average error probability is small instead of that the reconstruction algorithm works for every string. So there's been a lot of work here. First of all, not very surprising that you require fewer traces. Perhaps a bit surprising that you actually require sublinear number of traces for this. And again, this was first studied by Batu et al., where again, they considered a very small deletion probability, and we're not really interested in that. We're interested in constant deletion probability. There are three main works which share a very high-level recipe for this average case reconstruction. And I'm gonna present this high-level recipe, but I'm gonna focus on the work of Wallenstein et al. Also because this is gonna show up again later on when we talk about coded trace reconstruction. And this is enough. Basically, the other works use the same basically steps, but just with more refined algorithms inside. Okay, so here the setting is again that you have some string x. In this case, because we're dealing with average case reconstruction, x is uniformly random. And we have these traces in gray for that you want to use to recover x with high probability. So the first thing the way this algorithm is going to proceed, it's going to proceed bit by bit. So we're going to find the first few bits of x, then we're going to find, say, the ith bit, and then from that we can find the ith plus 1th bit, etc. So first of all, learning the first few bits of x is very easy, and you can do it essentially for free in the sense that you use very few traces. So now we assume that we know the first few bits of x, say x1 through xi minus 1. Our goal now is to find xi using very few traces. Okay, so the way one does this is first, there is a step of trace alignment. Here, this trace alignment is done by anchoring. So this is also a very standard technique when dealing with synchronization errors, where we fix a particular substring of x that we know, and we look for its occurrences in the traces. And one key property here that we need from x being random is that in this case, with high probability, if you see an anchor in your trace, then this anchor was generating, but by sending the original anchor to the deletion channel without any deletions. So we know exactly where this anchor comes from, and this anchor is very close to xi. So this means that the part of the trace after the anchor with high probability corresponds exactly to the trace of the part of X after the anchor. And we only care about that. So we're going to basically look just at the part of the trace after the anchor. Like I said, with high probability, this corresponds to the part of the part of X after the anchor. And one key property here that I want to stress is that in this green part, xi is one of the very first bits, and that's what you use. That's what you exploit to reconstruct xi with few traces. And the way you do this is essentially that you prove, and this is the technical meat of this algorithm really, that there is a special index, J star, somewhere between the end of the anchor and xi in the trace that is decently influenced by xi. What this means is that the distribution of yj star, or the probability that yj star equals 1, is very different or significantly different whether xi is 0 or xi is 1. In particular, you have an inequality like here on the right-hand side. And this gives a plan of attack by very standard technique. So if these two probabilities are different enough, you can just take the traces and use them to estimate the distribution of yj star. If you do this with enough traces, your estimate has as small enough error that you can correctly infer whether xi is 1 or xi is 0. And basically, this allows you to recover xi with very high probability using just polynomially many traces. And after you do this for xi, you repeat and do this for xi plus 1, xi plus 2, etc., until you recover the whole string. Okay, any questions about this?
Yeah, I have a question about recovering the first few bits. You said it's easy, like you can recover the first few bits and then move on from there. But how would you do that, like in terms of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give, so the general algorithm is a bit more complicated. I can, for example, if you want to recover just the first bit, you can just collect traces, right? And just look at the first bit of every trace, right? And count, let's say, the number of ones that you see. And that gives you, say, just take majority, and that will give you, say, if your deletion probability is small enough, that will give you the correct first bit, right? Okay. And after that, you use some, I mean, you kind of extend this result, this reasoning to a few more bits. But the idea is that you can do this for free for the first log n bits of x. Okay, so it's not a lot of bits, it's just like logarithmic number, but that's exactly how many bits you need to then bootstrap this procedure and start the trace alignment and the reconstruction bit by bit.
Yeah, and for a logarithmic number of bits with high probability, you can actually figure them out.
Yeah, yeah, you can figure them out with probability, say 1 minus 1 over n. Yeah, and then you start from there. So the first few bits are always easy. Okay. And this is actually, yeah.
By few, what do you mean few? Typically, have you done any experiments?
No, I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, few, I mean logarithmic number, like log n bits.
Logarithmic number. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You cannot. Yeah.
And then the anchor size must be less than log n, right? So how?
Yeah, the anchor size is roughly log n. So that you see it once every a polynomial number of traces, right? Because otherwise, I mean, you need already too many traces just to see the anchor. And
then once you see it, you just realign the traces. What happened? I missed the part that after.
Yeah. I mean, after you see the anchor, what happens there is that since your x is random, then with high probability, you're very sure that the part of the trace that comes after the anchor corresponds to the part of x that comes after the anchor.
So you can restart the whole thing, or what?
Yeah, so basically what this means is that you are partially synchronized, and now you're closer to xi.
Okay.
Right? Because xi was in the middle of x, and now, because of this anchoring, it's close to the beginning of the part after the anchor.
Well, then why not just redo the same thing then again? Why?
You mean run the? Yeah, that's not going to work because I mean this. Okay, so this process is not error free, So you need to be careful without the error probabilities add up. So it's not as straightforward anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anchor is a set of, anchor is also a string?
Yeah, anchor is a substring of X.
So that's also in log n?
Yeah, it's about logarithmic. Yeah, because you need it. So because the probability that the anchor is sent without any deletions needs to be 1 over poly n.
Do we set it ourselves, or do we pick something random to be an anchor?
It doesn't matter as long as it's a substring close enough to xi. I mean, you need to be careful with the parameters and the position, but it's any substring within that position, basically. It doesn't need to be a special string. Exactly because X is uniformly random.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
Do you have any intuition on the third claim you do in the third point? Like there is a special position yj star.
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, this is a slightly more complicated argument, but the idea is that xi is very close to the beginning of the green traces, let's say. So if you choose a position that's between the end of the anchor and xi, that's going to be decently influenced by xi. I really don't have a better intuition for that other than going through the math and showing that there is such an index. But yeah, for example, you could hope that this would work for, say, xi minus 1, right? Turns out it doesn't, because xi minus 1 could be very influenced by bits that come after xi. So you need to go a bit to the left. And if you're careful about this, it works. So by the way, I mean,
isn't this true for any xi?
It is true for any xi that, I mean, you need to look a bit to the left, but you need, for this argument to work, you need that your xi, in a sense, is one of the first few bits in your trace.
Okay.
When I say first few, I mean like polylog or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a very high level recipe. And I mean, I just want to say that, so the more recent works, the reconstruction process is slightly different. So for example, they use a variant of this worst case reconstruction argument that we saw with the complex and analytic tools to basically break the linear barrier for a number of traces. But I'm not going to go over that, also because of time constraints. I want to go over other stuff as well. Do you have any more questions?
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So moving on, I just want to say something about lower bounds, right? Because we've been talking about upper bounds for trace reconstruction, and lower bounds are a notoriously difficult subject. Many parts of information theory and also computer science, and here it's no different really. And as you can see, I mean, we have here a list of the lower bounds for both worst case and average case. And you see that there's a big gap between the upper bounds and the lower bounds. So I just want to give like a very quick overview of how would one prove a lower bound for trace reconstruction. So first of all, for worst case, it's pretty standard. I think it's pretty natural that if you want to prove a lower bound, what you do is you look at two specific strings and show that it's already hard to just distinguish between just these two strings. So of course, distinguishing between all the strings with trace reconstruction will be harder than this. Then for average case, it's a bit more subtle, because there you're basically dealing with a random string. But the way all the average case lower bounds work is by transferring the worst case lower bound to the average case setting by arguing that if you have a random string and you have a bad string of logarithmic length, it's going to show up many times in a random string. And so reconstructing a random string will be at least as hard as reconstructing many pairs of short bad strings. But since now your bad strings have length roughly logarithmic, you go from a poly n lower bound to a poly log n lower bound. So that's why this is why there's this shift from worst case to average case. Any questions or?
Yeah, we're good. So.
Okay. So going on, I'm just going to give I said that people look at explicit strings for getting these lower bounds for worst case reconstruction. I just wanted to present them. So on the left-hand side, we have the strings that give you the linear lower bound for worst case reconstruction. And they're very simple. So the idea is that you have a 1 and then a bunch of zeros. And from one string to the other, you just shift 1 by an index, by a position. And the reason why this is easy to analyze is that trace reconstruction for these strings is essentially equivalent to distinguishing two binomial distributions with slightly different parameters. And there it's a very easy argument to argue that n samples from these binomial distributions are required for you to distinguish between them with high probability. And so this n traces are required to distinguish between these two strings. Now, the strings on the right-hand side, it's a very different setting because it's a much more difficult problem. They're much more difficult to analyze. But essentially, they are obtained from the left-hand side by replacing every 0 by a 0, 1, every 1 by a 1, 0. So now you have alternating zeros and ones, and this makes it very, very difficult to handle because you need to analyze deletions over these strings. And I'm not going over the technicalities. That would be just too much. But one thing I want to say is that both these arguments with these specific strings are tight. So you cannot improve the lower bounds by just looking at these two strings. You really need to come up with new pairs of strings to break these lower bounds. Okay, any questions?
No, we're good.
Okay, great. So yeah.
Interrupt you if there are questions. So.
Sorry?
We will interrupt you if we.
Okay, great. Okay. So yeah, this was basically all I wanted to say about uncoded trace reconstruction. We'll now go into coded trace reconstruction, but just summing up, here's a summary of the bounds, the best bounds that we have, just re-emphasizing that there's an almost exponential gap between upper bounds and lower bounds. And that, I mean, this is tough. I mean, this is natural because deletions are tough to handle, and we need new ideas to improve this because the lower bounds are tight. The upper bound for worst case reconstruction is also tight for mean-based algorithms. So new ideas are welcome. And one thing that I didn't explicitly mention, but that I should mention, is that all these results are over the binary alphabet. So your input string is binary. This is the hardest setting for deletions, but we will see that when you go for, we'll see that for coded reconstruction, when you go to larger alphabets, you also get some interesting results. Okay, so we're moving on into coded trace reconstruction. And like I said, there is a new motivation for trace reconstruction beyond this multiple sequence alignment that we already discussed. So, and this comes from what's called portable DNA-based data storage. This was first introduced by Yazdi, Gabriel, and Milenkovic, and then later on by Organic et al. And basically, I'm just going to give a lightning introduction to DNA-based storage. So basically, in DNA-based storage, you want to encode data into a DNA strand. So the way you do this is that you encode data with some codebook into the AGTC alphabet, and then this is synthesized with some technologies into a DNA strand. And after this, at some point, you will want to read your data back from the DNA. The way this is done in portable DNA-based storage is by what's called a nanopore sequencer, where you take a DNA strand on the left, you send it through several pores, and each pore produces a noisy read of the contents of your DNA strand. So in a sense, this is a trace reconstruction problem because from these noisy reads, you want to recover the contents of the DNA strand. The errors that are inflicted by the nanopore can be insertions, deletions, and substitutions. Although it is discussed in Yazdi et al. That basically you can run some sequence alignment algorithms so that deletions are really the most important errors. And so here we have this trace reconstruction problem where notably, unlike before, the left-hand side, so the input can be coded. So the input can come from a codebook that you design to minimize the number of traces required, because these, of course, cost money. Of course, these systems, there are working systems that use this. So there are coding schemes that can be reconstructed from few traces. The problem there is that these coding schemes really are only based on heuristics. So you really have no mathematical guarantees that indeed they work or how many traces they require when you scale them up, because this was all done only for fixed block lengths. Okay, so this practical setting really motivates the setting of coded trace reconstruction that was introduced in our paper, which is very similar to the original trace reconstruction setting, except that now the input string can come from a codebook of our choice. So we designed the codebook, and we have a few requirements. So first, so that this doesn't become just a trivial problem. First thing is that we want the code to have high rate. So the rate should approach 1 with the block length. Second, the code words should be reconstructable from few traces with high probability. And third, this code should be efficiently encodable and reconstructable. And here efficient, we mean polynomial time in the block length. Okay, any questions about this? Or I guess you'll interrupt if you have questions. So I'll just continue.
Just one question.
Yeah,
so
sure.
You mentioned earlier that DNA storage means we typically use uncoded trace reconstruction at the earlier when you were starting to talk about uncoded. What is the difference between that and coded trace?
No, I mean, so when you do multiple sequence alignment, you're not really encoding your input string because you're dealing with DNA from some species. But in DNA storage, you're allowed to code your input, basically, because your input is data that you stored in the DNA strand. So you're able to encode it in a special way.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So this is our setting, and our goal is to design these codes. So first of all, there is some related work to coded trace reconstruction, because this is also a natural information theoretic problem, a coding theoretic problem as well. So for example, Eugler and Mitzemacher, they studied the case where you have a constant number of traces and you want to design codebooks for this. In our case, the number of traces will scale with the block length. And they basically determined the first order capacity for small deletion probability. So this generalizes a well-known result from the late 2000s. But this cannot be generalized from constant number of traces to varying number of traces. Another work, very recent, that was presented at ISIT this year, studied coding for multiple deletion channels, but only with constant number of deletions. In our case, we have a constant rate of deletions, and they are IID. They have a different approach from the works that we will see now, because they use Varchamov-Tenengold's codes, and they basically use ideas from file synchronization. And one thing that maybe occurred to you is that, I mean, results from average case reconstruction already give some results about coded trace reconstruction, in the sense that they show existence of large codes that are reconstructable from few traces. The problem here, the main difference to our work, is that one, we want our codes to be efficiently encodable, and second, we want to use even fewer traces than average case reconstruction by relaxing the size of the code. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some constructions from our work and also from a very recent work that came after ours. So we're going to start slow, and just to see what we get if you consider just a very simple construction where we combine markers, which are very standard tools for dealing with synchronization errors, with just off-the-shelf worst-case trace reconstruction. Okay, so how does this basic construction work? Well, say you want to encode some n-bit string x. First of all, you split this string into blocks of size polylog, where here I say log squared, but it can be say log 1 plus epsilon for any epsilon. Then you encode each block with an appropriate subcode, or maybe you want to call it inner code. And then you concatenate this, but you add some markers in between the subcode words, right? And these markers are just a long run of zeros followed by a long run of ones, where by long, I mean these runs have lengths roughly logarithmic in the length of x. The reason why this is the case is really that if you send these runs or these markers through the deletion channel, with high probability, you will still see long runs of zeros and a long run of zeros and a long run of ones. Okay. All right. So you have a code that kind of looks like this. How would reconstruction work? And reconstruction will be very simple if we are careful with the design of our subcode. So say if you have your code, you apply some deletions and you get a trace, right? So like I said, key observation is that the trace of a marker still looks like a marker because you will still see a long run of zeros followed by a long run of ones. So what we can hope for is that if we design our subcode so that the traces of the red blocks don't have long run of zeros, then you can find the markers by just looking for long runs of zeros in your trace. Not only that, but you can find the separation between the green part and the yellow part by looking for the first one after a long run of zeros. This is all with high probability. Once you do this, you essentially, again, this is kind of like anchoring, and you partially synchronize your string. You can do what we call trace splitting or trace alignment, if you'd like, where now we know which part of the trace corresponds to each block. And after we have this, we have split the trace into parts of size roughly polylog n. And if you don't want to really think too much about it anymore, we can just apply worst case trace reconstruction to reconstruct each block, then concatenate and decode. You might recall that, I mean, worst case reconstruction is expensive, but since we're applying it to very short strings, it's not expensive anymore. So if you do the math, you get this kind of verbose statement saying that you can get an efficiently encodable and reconstructable code with rate roughly 1 minus 1 over log n, using essentially as many traces as the state-of-the-art result for average case reconstruction. Okay, any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you really need this green and yellow markers after you do the splitting?
I mean, you do, because you don't know where the markers end and the code words begin. I guess you could do something where you add more long runs of zeros or ones at the end or at the start of your code word. But that's not really, I mean, that wouldn't really matter. That would give you the same redundancy. So you really do need the markers there because you cannot differentiate. Yeah.
Okay.
So these markers are added on the coded word?
Yeah, these markers are basically separate code words.
I mean, what I mean is this is after deletion, right?
That's after, yeah, that's after deletions, but the markers are still, after deletions, the markers still look like long runs of zeros followed by a long run of ones.
That means that you add the markers post.
No. You add the markers are part of your code word. So you have inner code words separated by markers. Okay, that's your full code word.
My question is, do markers go through deletion channel or no?
Oh yeah, they do. Yeah, of course. The whole thing goes through a deletion channel.
Then how can we be sure that there are no burst errors which take away?
There won't be, because the markers are long enough. So with high probability, you won't see a burst error of, like, you won't see log n bits being deleted in a row, except with very small probability.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So the only thing that's really missing here is that we haven't designed the subcode to have the properties that we want. In essence, the subcode should be dense enough, so it should have a lot of ones in every short substring so that you don't see long runs of zeros in the trace. So a tool that we're going to use for that, we're going to borrow from pseudo-randomness. And this tool is also going to be useful later on in our other construction. So we're going to use what's called the almost k-wise independent string, which is just a string where if you look at any k bits, they look almost close, they're almost uniform, and this error to uniform is dictated by this epsilon term. Now, first, the reason why we care about this is that there's a classic result by Alon et al. That says that for decent parameters, I'm not going to specify what they are, we can efficiently generate these strings starting from just a few uniformly random bits. So this is a classic result in pseudo-randomness. A more specific result is here below, but in essence, what this gives is that there is an efficient generator that takes t uniformly random bits and outputs a longer t, where t is logarithmic in the size of the string that you want, and outputs an almost k-wise independent string. So, of course, it's not very clear how we're going to exploit this, but I'm going to get to it now. The property that we want, sorry, is that we want no long runs of zeros in the trace, because this allows for this trace splitting or trace alignment. So the way this works is that we're going to look at this generator that we have from this work by Alon et al. With a logarithmic number of uniformly random bits. And one thing, so first of all, if you just consider a uniformly random C, it satisfies the property that we want with high probability. But you can say something stronger, and you can say that not only a uniformly random string works, but actually an almost k-wise independent string also works and will also satisfy the desired property with high probability. And we exploit this in the following way. Say that you want to encode some x. First of all, you mask it. So we call this the masking technique. You mask it with the output of the generator on uniform input. This will satisfy the property with high probability. But now what this means, what you can translate this probabilistic result into something existential that says that there is a good fixing of the uniform bits that enforces the property. And since there are so few uniform bits, you can literally iterate through all the possibilities and find and choose the one that satisfies the property. So when you do this, you just take the z that you've chosen so that the property is satisfied, and you prepend it to the mask, so x plus g of z. And this is your encoding. And it turns out that this is enough for our basic construction. Any questions?
No, we're good.
Okay. So, like I said before, this basic construction that we saw, it's very nice, very simple. It gets us pretty close to average case reconstruction, except we don't beat it. And ideally, we'd like to use much fewer traces than average case reconstruction. And this is what we're going to do in part 2. I'm going to present 2 constructions, one from my paper with Magdi, Ryan, and Olgica, and another one from a more recent paper by Brakenziekli and Spank, where basically, instead of being too wasteful and not exploiting the structure of the subcode when performing trace reconstruction, we're going to leverage ideas from average case reconstruction to decrease the number of traces required. Okay, so we're going to start chronologically with our work. So our starting point is what's called subsequence-unique strings that were introduced by Allenstein et al. And intuitively, a string is subsequence-unique if, when you look at any small substring, you don't see it as a subsequence of any other small substring, except for trivial cases. Now, this is useful because if you recall this algorithm that we went through just a while ago, what the algorithm actually, what the result actually says is that if the deletion probability is a small enough constant, then you can do efficient trace reconstruction for subsequence unique strings using just polynomially many traces. And this gives something for average case because a random string, a uniformly random string, is subsequence unique with high probability. But actually, one thing that we observe is that you don't need a uniformly random string. Actually, an almost k-wise independent string is also subsequence unique with the right parameters with high probability. So
about the definition. So here, W subsequence unique. You're talking about the same sequence. So you consider one X, one sequence.
Yeah. So if you look at any substring of X, and you look at two substrings, one substring of length W, and another substring of length 1.1 times W, so slightly longer. You don't see the first substring as a subsequence of the second substring.
Okay.
For any pairs, except for the trivial cases where the first one is contained in the second.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So like I said, an almost k-wise independent string satisfies this property, which, given what we were discussing before, already suggests a plan of attack, which is pretty obvious, which is that we're going to consider the same structure as before. So we have sub-code words or inner code words separated by these markers, which are a long run of zeros followed by a long run of ones. But now our inner code will change. And instead of, again, we're going to use masking, but instead of choosing the uniformly random bits so instead of choosing the input to the generator that satisfies just that the code word is dense in terms of the number of ones, we want to ensure that this X plus G of Z is subsequence unique. And you can do that because the X plus G of some uniform input is subsequence unique with high probability. Okay, so then you just iterate over all possible inputs and efficiently find the one satisfying the property. So
what is the length of X here?
Length of X, sorry, yeah, it's a bit confusing. So here I'm writing X for the length of a block. So it's M, here it's log squared N, where N is the total block length.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I mean, I should have used another letter.
No, because Z is log M, I thought it should be log, but it's
yeah,
M.
but it's log N, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, like I said, we're going to use the same structure. So we're going to use the same reconstruction idea where we're going to do trace splitting. So in the end, we really only need to care about trace reconstruction of strings that look like this. So you have a long run of ones, followed by the inner code word, followed by a long run of zeros. And with a bit of hindsight, we want to do this using just poly M traces, which is poly log N traces. And this beats the best result for average case reconstruction. So one natural thing to consider here is to say, well, does the HMPW algorithm that we discussed before, does it work immediately for strings like this? And the answer is that it doesn't work. And I'm just going to present the first barrier that we go into when we try to make it work, which is that, if you recall, there is a bootstrapping step in this HMPW algorithm where you need to know the first few bits, in this case of X plus G of Z for free. The problem now is that X plus G of Z is in the middle of the string. So you need way too many traces for the bootstrapping. In fact, you would need poly N traces, which is just too much. But you're going to see how we can reduce the number of traces needed for bootstrapping using the flexibility of our masking encoding. So what you can do first, like you want to find out the first few bits of the mask X plus G of Z. Well, instead of encoding X, try encoding X, but prepend it with some zeros. What happens now is that if you find Z, you already find the first few bits of the mask automatically, because you can just compute G of Z, and the first few bits of the mask, in this case, will coincide with G of Z. Okay, so now we reduce the problem of the bootstrapping to just finding Z. But this has an easy solution because Z is very short. So we can be a bit more wasteful and protect it with a code that is very robust against deletions and insertions. So that's what we do. We add this zero here in the encoding of Z prime, really because just to distinguish from the long run of ones before. But after we do this, finding Z is very easy, and we can do it after replacing Z and X by Z prime and X prime. we can find Z just using order of M traces. And because of our reduction, this implies that you can also do bootstrapping with order of M traces. Okay. Any questions?
No, we're good.
Okay, let's continue then. Right, so this is the first barrier. There are a few more things to consider that I won't go over. First of all, we actually need a stronger property than subsequence uniqueness because of the markers. Also, we need to make sure that trace splitting works. So all I said before was assuming that trace splitting works. So your code words need to be dense in number of ones. But this can be easily fixed by using the properties of the almost k-wise independent generator. And this essentially gives us an improved result because now we leverage ideas from average case reconstruction. We can use fewer traces than just using worst case reconstruction. So we get same rate as before, but now we only need polylog n traces with a small caveat that this only works if the deletion probability is a small enough constant. Okay. All right, so let me just check on time. Okay, I still have like 15 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay, so let's continue. So now this is the main result from our paper actually, and very recently another work came up by Barkensiak, Lee, and Spang. Very nice work, where they also construct codes for coded trace reconstruction. And their starting point is something that I already mentioned, which is trace reconstruction over large alphabets. So one natural thing to ask is that, okay, we've been dealing with codes over the binary alphabet, and that's a very hard problem. How easy does it become if one is allowed to have a larger alphabet? In this case, they consider the following setting where you have a code of rate 1 minus epsilon of alphabet size basically only depending on epsilon. And they show that you can have a code that only requires roughly log 1 over epsilon traces, and actually that this is tight. And this is going to be their starting point to then obtain binary codes with good trace reconstruction properties by code concatenation. So we're going to start by just going over this code, this setting over large alphabets. The proof is very simple, and it introduces a technique that I like a lot. So first of all, the lower bound for this is a one-liner. So because if you want to show that any code of rate 1 minus epsilon requires log 1 over epsilon traces, you can just use the obvious fact that the T-use deletion channel is worse than the T-use erasure channel. And the capacity of the T-use erasure channel is very simple to compute because this channel is really equivalent to an erasure channel with erasure probability d to the t, where t is the number of uses or equivalently the number of traces. So after you do this, you can just plug in the rate of the code. You get this inequality. If you rearrange it, you get the lower bound on the number of traces. Okay, any questions? I think this is pretty straightforward. Okay. So let's move on. How do you, now the thing is that we want to match this lower bound up to maybe a constant with an alphabet that only depends on the rate epsilon. So the tool for this is what's called the synchronization string. And these were introduced by Eupler and Charasby in 2017. And essentially a string is S is a tau synchronization string if the edit distance between any disjoint consecutive substrings is nearly maximal. Okay, so intuitively, yeah, you have edit distance close to maximal over any two pairs of consecutive substrings of S. And one thing they prove is that you can construct these strings efficiently over an alphabet of size poly 1 over tau. Okay. And why is this useful? How can this be used? Or, well, this can be used for indexing. And what is indexing? So, for example, when you're dealing with deletions, one idea that is very basic is to, if you're okay with blowing up the alphabet that you're working on, say that you have a code word, you can index it naively. So instead of having your symbols be C1, C2, Cn, your symbols now are pairs of symbols, where the first symbol is a code word symbol, the second symbol is the index corresponding to that code word symbol. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because if you take deletions over this blown up alphabet code word, this is equivalent in a straightforward way to erasures over the original code word. So we just transformed deletions into erasures. Problem here is that you're blowing up the size of your alphabet by log n bits, which is way too much. We don't want that. The amazing thing about synchronization strings is that they do the same, but only with a constant alphabet size blowup. And the reason why this happens is that if you take a synchronization string and you apply dn deletions, where here they can be worst case deletions, and you get some s prime, you can take the symbols from S prime and you can run what's called an error-free indexing algorithm. So this indexing algorithm basically looks at the bits of S prime and finds the correct indices. So it either returns the correct index in S for each symbol, or for some symbols it may abort and say, I don't know which index it is, let's just treat it as an erasure, or they call it also a misdecoding. And one thing they do is that they show that there is a very simple greedy algorithm that is an error-free indexing algorithm with at most these many misdecodings. So this kind of gives the strategy for constructing our code over a large alphabet, because these synchronization strings really only blow up the alphabet size by a constant or poly 1 over tau.
Well, I didn't
yeah, sure.
I didn't understand how the sequences are used to index.
So the idea is that instead of indexing like 1, 2, 3 up to n, you index with the symbols of the synchronization string.
Oh, like the first, so you pick one synchronization string.
Yeah, there's a fixed synchronization string of a given length. Oh. Okay, and you just attach the first symbol to the first code word symbol, the second symbol to the second code word symbol, etc. And then if you want, go on.
Why would it work?
It works because after when you get the output of the deletion channel on this blown up alphabet, you can run this indexing algorithm to recover most of the indices. Some of them you won't be able to recover. You will treat them as erasures, but most of them, just by looking at the second symbol of the pair and running the indexing algorithm, you can recover the index in the original, in the input string.
And the synchronization sequence is over the same alphabet as the message?
No. The message is over whatever alphabet you want. And then your synchronization string, it has this parameter tau. It is over an alphabet of size poly 1 over tau.
And it's different alphabet.
Different alphabet, yeah, completely different alphabet. Yeah, but then when you blow up the alphabet by indexing, because you basically take the direct product.
Kind of you're reusing the indices, like instead of your index being one.
Yeah. So naive indexing, you have a different symbol for each index. Here you have repeated symbols, but your string has a special structure that allows you to still be able to synchronize and find the true indices for a lot of the indices.
It would be a good intuition that you kind of reuse the symbol after you use them in a while, like.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the main thing, because you need edit distance to be large, right? So you need a lot of different symbols, a lot of different structure, different ordering. Yeah.
How hard is it to construct these sequences?
Not too hard. You can do it efficiently. And for example, this indexing algorithm is also very easy. It's just a greedy algorithm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, the construction is exactly like I was saying. You just take a code, say over even a binary alphabet that corrects a decent fraction of erasures, and the code has high rate. And then what you do is you index the code words of C with the synchronization string S, okay? Now, since the synchronization string S has alphabet size that only depends on epsilon, and the same is true for C, you get a code over an alphabet also of size only depending on epsilon, which is what we wanted. And now reconstruction from the traces is very easy because, okay, so this is the code that we see. The traces that we see are going to be of this form. So you have pairs of symbols. You just don't know the indices where they come from, right? That's why you do synchronization. So it's like I was saying before, we're going to look at the second symbol of the pair because those correspond to the synchronization string. And we're going to run the error-free indexing algorithm on these second symbols. This will give us a bunch of indices and also a bunch of aborts or of erasures. For each, we know that each index that the algorithm outputs, it's correct. It matches the true index of that pair, which means that for the true indices, we can recover the code word symbols, right? Because if you recover, say, index I1 from the first pair, this means that the index I1 of the code word is equal to X11, and the same for I3. While if you abort, you just treat it as an erasure, but you have this outer code kind of that corrects these erasures. Okay, so this is actually exactly what we do. The only thing we need to do to bound the number of erasures really is just bound the number of misdecodings and also bound the number of symbols that are deleted in every trace. So you need to make this small. It turns out that if you take your number of traces to be roughly order log 1 over epsilon, the number of erasures is small enough that your code C can correct them. Any questions?
Everything's okay.
Okay, so this gives us, it's a very nice result because it's a tight result for trace reconstruction over a large alphabet. And like I said, this is a starting point from going from large alphabets to binary codes. So the idea is that you want to transfer these good properties to the binary alphabet. One way people usually do this is by code concatenation, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. So again, you want to encode an n-bit string X. First of all, you encode it with an outer code, but now instead of just correcting erasures, it also corrects substitutions. So it's a bit stronger, but that's fine. It's very standard. So this code has high rate over a large alphabet. I'm not going to say the size of the alphabet now because it's flexible and it's going to be determined later. And we take a synchronization string over a constant size alphabet and we index the code words of this outer code with this synchronization string. So this is essentially, it is our outer code. Now we're going to concatenate with the binary code. So we're going to take every pair of symbols. So we have a code word symbol and the synchronization symbol, and we're going to encode both with a binary code. So we take the code word symbol and we encode it with a code that's kind of similar to what we had in our paper. You have markers, which are a long run of zeros. Then you have an inner code word called CI bar, and then a long run of ones. Here C bar I, like before, for this trace alignment procedure to work, C bar I needs to be dense. It has to have a lot of ones in every short substring. Then you want to do the same for the synchronization symbol. But one good thing about the synchronization symbol is that they're much smaller. They're over a constant size alphabet, so you can be wasteful and protect it with a code that's very robust against deletion. So essentially what you do is you replace the synchronization symbol by long runs, alternating long runs of zeros and ones. And what happens is that intuitively, you're going to encode the synchronization symbol into the run length of this string. Okay, so in the end, what you get, very high level, you get a string that looks like this, which is kind of similar to ours, but there are these more alternating long runs of zeros and ones corresponding to the synchronization symbol. There are the red blocks corresponding to the code word symbols. And here, the parameters are a bit different than ours. So, but let's see how reconstruction would hopefully work. And so, like I said, since the parameters are flexible, they can be small enough that, like someone was asking me before, that now you can have burst errors and basically destroy a whole consecutive part of your code word. So in the end, you get this trace. But here we kind of proceed similar to our reconstruction algorithm, but then we are actually able to use the synchronization strings to exploit the markers in a more careful way. So first thing is that since our inner code words are dense, long runs really only come from markers or from the synchronization symbols, which means we can find the traces of most synchronization symbols and we can recover them because they are encoded with codes that are very robust against deletions and insertions. Okay, so this is what you do. You recover the synchronization symbol. And you do this for a bunch of synchronization symbols because then you can run the error-free indexing algorithm. And for most of them, you will be able to recover the true index I of this synchronization symbol. This is useful because with high probability, whatever comes before the synchronization symbol corresponds to a trace of the code word symbol with high probability. So in essence, these synchronization symbols give us a way of clustering our traces so that you cluster the traces according to the code word symbol, and then you could hope to run a trace reconstruction algorithm for each of the clusters to recover most of the code word symbols and correct the rest with your outer code. Okay, so exactly what I was saying, that you want to cluster the traces, recover them, hope that your inner code has good trace reconstruction properties so that most of the code word symbols are recovered correctly, and then correct the remaining errors with your outer code. Any questions so far? So,
no, that's good.
Yeah, this is relatively, so the reconstruction procedure is relatively similar to the one from the previous code constructions, but then they can exploit the synchronization strings. So they have this extra concatenation step. So the only thing that's missing, like before, is really designing the inner code. And the way this is done is that, first of all, an observation is that the markers here have length log m, while in our case, the length was square root m. And this difference in length is really, really important because it allows you to essentially be able to brute force your code word. Sorry, you're able to brute force your code so that it has good average, good trace reconstruction properties, because you just rely on existential results for average case reconstruction. Okay, so you can make sure by brute forcing that your code C bar has good trace reconstruction properties, and second, it is dense, which allows for this trace alignment procedure. Okay, and so if you kind of instantiate this with the best result for average case reconstruction, you can brute force a code C bar that can be reconstructable from just exponential of cubic root log m traces. Okay, any questions?
No.
Okay, so this is all doable if your length m, which is related to the alphabet size of your outer code, is small enough, because otherwise you cannot brute force it. So if you do this, of course, this is just very high level idea. The actual reconstruction algorithm is a bit more technical. It needs a bit more care with the parameters. But the idea basically is that if you set your inner code length, which is very related to the, like I said, the alphabet size of your outer code, to be roughly 1 over epsilon times log 1 over epsilon. This is needed to ensure that the rate is at least 1 minus epsilon. Then you get a code that can be reconstructed from these exponentially cubic root log 1 over epsilon traces. And this gives actually something stronger, because this gives a kind of a black box reduction from any average case reconstruction algorithm to a code that can be reconstructed from few traces. But like I said, there is a small caveat here because, as I said, you need to brute force the inner code. And so this takes time that is exponential in M. So if in this case, M is equal to 1 over epsilon times log 1 over epsilon. So if epsilon is too small, this code construction will not be efficient. So the only way you could hope for it to be efficient is that if you have some pre-processing and you're allowed to have some super polynomial pre-processing, and you're allowed to have a big lookup table so that encoding can be efficient. Any questions? I know this is very high level, but
no, we're...
Okay. So this basically wraps up what I wanted to say about code constructions. Here's a very quick summary. I guess the main takeaway message, if there's something you could really take away from this talk, is really that we can exploit worst case and average case reconstruction results and ideas to design efficient high rate codes that require significantly fewer traces. And actually, something that I didn't cover here, they can also satisfy other nice properties. So this is just a comparison. Like I said, for example, if you specify it for epsilon equals 1 over log n, so your rate is 1 minus 1 over log n, our main result gets you polylog n traces with efficient encoding and reconstruction. Then if you use these clever ideas with synchronization strings, you can reduce the number of traces with the caveat that now code construction is not efficient anymore. But if you allow your epsilon to be larger, so the rate of your code to be a bit smaller, then you can get fewer traces with efficient encoding and reconstruction and any arbitrary constant deletion probability. Okay, just one thing that's missing here that I didn't talk about, also for time constraints, is that there are lower bounds for coded trace reconstruction. So essentially, you can translate any bound for average case reconstruction to coded trace reconstruction. And so right now we have a polylog 1 over epsilon lower bound, which is still very far away from our upper bounds for coded trace reconstruction. So again, there's a lot of stuff to do. And I'm going to finish up just by leaving a few remarks for future work. So first of all, very naturally, I mean, people can hope to find better high rate codes that use fewer traces. Second one is, as we saw in both coded and uncoded trace reconstruction, there's a very big gap between lower bounds and upper bounds, which needs some very new ideas to be kind of narrowed. And finally, and this is something I really like, is that the codes that we have right now, they are based on markers. And these markers fail in a spectacular way if you include insertions, not only deletions. So it will be very interesting. It would require other ideas to design high rate codes that handle deletions and random insertions with few traces. And that wraps it up. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I hope I didn't run over the time a lot, but yeah.
So I think it's okay because people can watch it on YouTube, and then if they it's a good introduction to the field. Thanks again. So I don't know if anyone we asked lots of questions, but if anyone else have questions, so they can ask you now. Yeah, I guess there are no more questions.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So thanks again. Hi, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Joao.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.